Naval Station Bahrain sits on the northern edge of Manama, its piers extending into the shallow coastal waters of the Persian Gulf, on the island that has been the anchor of the U.S. Fifth Fleet's operational presence in the region since 1995. It is not a large installation by the standards of major naval bases. What it is essential. The administrative, logistical, and operational hub from which the Fifth Fleet commands and sustains every naval asset deployed across an area of responsibility that stretches from the Red Sea through the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf to the Pakistani coastline. The ships that berth at its piers are not always the same ships. The mission is always the same: presence, projection, persistence. The night of the engagement, 4 vessels were alongside the piers. A destroyer on a scheduled maintenance period, its VLS magazine being serviced, 2 of its forward cells temporarily offline for cell gasket replacement, a routine procedure that the maintenance schedule had placed in the current week. A supply ship, loading provisions for the next underway replenishment cycle. A patrol craft, in for minor repair to its propulsion system. And a frigate that had arrived the previous afternoon from a transit that had taken it through the Hormuz corridor and into the Gulf. Its crew in the early hours of a port call that most of them had been anticipating for 3 weeks. The base's air defense architecture was not the same as the seagoing architecture of a deployed destroyer. A shore-based air defense at a fixed installation relies on a different sensor and weapon integration than the organic Aegis capability of a surface combatant. Ground-based radar systems, Patriot missile batteries positioned at the installation's perimeter, CIWS mounts emplaced on the pier structures, and the coordination integration that links these elements together through a joint air defense command that monitors the threat picture from a facility on the installation and maintains connectivity with the broader regional air defense network. The architecture was capable. It was also designed around a threat model that assumed sufficient warning time to bring all elements to full readiness. Warning time measured in minutes, not seconds. At 4:12 a.m., the threat model's warning time assumption failed. The intelligence picture in the preceding 72 hours had been elevated in patterns that the regional analysts had assessed as consistent with preparation for some form of Iranian maritime operation. The same collection signatures that had been running at elevated levels for 10 days across the Gulf region. The same pattern that had generated threat assessments for the destroyers and frigates on patrol in the Strait approaches. The assessments had focused on the mobile maritime threat, fast attack boats, loitering munitions, drone swarms launched from coastal positions against patrolling warships. Fixed installation attack had been noted as a theoretical capability. The Iranian inventory included cruise missile systems with the range to reach Bahrain from coastal positions along the Gulf's northern shore. But the assessed probability of a fixed base attack had been rated lower than the assessed probability of maritime patrol interdiction, based on the escalation calculus that a direct strike on a foreign naval installation represents. Compared to an attack on a warship in international waters, the assessment was not wrong about the capability. It was wrong about the probability. The launches came from 3 separate positions along the Iranian coastline facing the southern Gulf. Positions distributed across approximately 60 nautical miles of coastline from east to west. Their geographic separation chosen to ensure that the approach vectors of the missiles from each launch position converged on the target from 3 different bearings simultaneously, preventing the base's air defense architecture from concentrating its response against a single approach axis. The missiles were cruise missiles, Iranian-manufactured systems with the range and sea-skimming capability to transit the southern Gulf at low altitude, staying below the radar coverage provided by the base's ground-based search systems until they cleared the geographic horizon defined by the Gulf's shallow water surface return environment. At 112 nautical miles range from the base, the missiles were below the radar horizon. At 81 nautical miles, they were still below it. At 57 nautical miles, the base's primary search radar, a system optimized for the threat environment that the installation's designers had planned for, rather than the threat environment that was now inbound, registered the first contacts, 57 nautical miles. The missile's transit speed placed them at approximately 6 minutes and 40 seconds from the base perimeter at that range. 6 minutes and 40 seconds to spin up the Patriot battery. Coordinate the engagement sequence with the pier-mounted CIWS systems. Transmit the threat warning to the ships alongside, and clear the pier areas of personnel who had been conducting maintenance and loading operations in the pre-dawn hours. The Joint Air Defense Command watch officer at the installation recognized the contact signature in approximately 8 seconds and made 2 calls simultaneously. The first was to the Patriot Battery Tactical Control Center. Immediate threat, authorized engagement. The second was to the Base Operations Center. Threat warning. All hands to covered positions. Ships prepare for inbound missile threat. On the destroyer at Pier 4, the warning reached the CIC watch team. A reduced watch, sized for a maintenance period rather than for full combat operations, at 4:12 a.m. and 31 seconds. 2 of the forward VLS cells were offline for maintenance. The maintenance crew was still physically inside the cell access area when the warning sounded. Their extraction from the cell structure and the emergency closure of the maintenance access, a procedure that under normal circumstances takes 8 minutes, was executed in approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds by a team that had trained on emergency VLS recovery procedures without having previously executed them under actual alert conditions. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The 2 cells came back online at 4:16 a.m. and 52 seconds. The total missile flight time from first radar detection was 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The cells came online with approximately 2 minutes and 20 seconds of intercept window remaining. The Patriot battery had begun its engagement sequence at 4:12 a.m. and 51 seconds, 20 seconds after the Air Defense Command's initial call. The Patriot system's engagement timeline from threat detection to first interceptor launch is compressed by the integration of radar, command, and control, and launcher into a single coordinated architecture. But it is not instantaneous. The threat contacts numbered 19 at first reliable track count. 19 cruise missiles in a distributed approach formation, coming from 3 separate bearing sectors. Their individual approach vectors converging on the installation from bearings roughly separated by 60-degree intervals across the northern horizon. 19 contacts. The Patriot battery's initial salvo allocation was 6 interceptors, 2 allocated to the leading contacts from each of the 3 approach bearings, fired in a ripple sequence that the system's engagement control automatically optimized for coverage across the 3-axis threat geometry. 6 interceptors for 19 contacts accepted the mathematical reality that the outer layer engagement could not address the entire threat package, and that the pier-mounted CIWS systems would have to handle the terminal defense for whatever the Patriot battery did not resolve. The first Patriot interceptor launched at 4:13 a.m. and 44 seconds. The Patriot interceptor is a significantly larger and faster weapon than the naval interceptors deployed on the destroyer's VLS. Its guidance and engagement geometry are optimized for the fixed position, ground-based engagement of inbound missiles and aircraft. And its performance against a sea-skimming cruise missile in its terminal phase represents a more demanding tracking problem than the system's original design envelope. The Iranian missiles were flying their final approach at approximately 15 meters altitude, low enough to stay below the optimal engagement envelope for the Patriot's standard intercept geometry, forcing the battery's engagement control to use a modified solution that accepted a more difficult intercept angle in exchange for coverage of the low-altitude threat. First intercept confirmed at 41 nautical miles. Second intercept confirmed at 38 nautical miles. Third Patriot missed. The target's terminal maneuver displaced it out of the intercept corridor at the last moment, a bearing change of approximately 8 degrees that exceeded the fusing geometry's lethal radius at the missed distance. The 4th, 5th, and 6th Patriot interceptors each connected. 3 more contacts eliminated in the midcourse engagement layer. 5 contacts eliminated. 14 remaining. 41 nautical miles and closing fast. The Patriot battery reloaded and launched a second salvo of 4 interceptors against the surviving contacts, prioritizing the leading elements of each approach axis. 3 additional intercepts confirmed. 1 miss, the same modified low-altitude geometry problem occurring as the missiles descended to approximately 8 meters altitude in their terminal approach phase, below the optimal fusing altitude for the intercept mode the battery was employing. 8 contacts eliminated total by the Patriot battery. 11 remaining. 22 nautical miles from the base perimeter. On the destroyer, the 2 recovered VLS cells had come online at 4:16 a.m. and 52 seconds, 2 minutes and 12 seconds before the leading missile contacts were projected to reach the pier area. The destroyer's Aegis system had been running threat track updates through the tactical data link that connected the ship to the Joint Air Defense Command's common picture, giving the ship's fire control system a continuous, updated view of the inbound contacts that had been building since first radar detection. When the VLS cells came online, the fire control system already had engagement solutions built for the highest priority contacts in the current picture. 2 SM-2 interceptors launched at 4:17 a.m. and 8 seconds, the first offensive action by the ship itself since the alert had begun. The missiles leaving their recovered cells on trajectories that angled northward over the harbor waters toward the approaching contacts. Both connected at 17 nautical miles. 2 more contacts eliminated, 9 remaining. A third SM-2 launched 30 seconds later against a contact that had separated from the main approach axis on a bearing that placed it approaching the base from the northwest rather than the north, a course deviation that had apparently been programmed into the specific missile's terminal guidance to exploit the specific gap in coverage that existed between the Patriot battery's optimal engagement arc and the destroyer's firing geometry from its pier position. The SM-2 reached it at 15 nautical miles. 8 remaining. The frigate at Pier 7 had a more limited organic air defense capability. No VLS, but a single CIWS mount on its forward deck that the frigate's watch team had activated and placed in automatic engagement mode as soon as the threat warning had been received. The CIWS mount's surface and air search was operating in its maximum sensitivity configuration, tracking the inbound contacts as they appeared in its acquisition range. The mount's effective engagement range against a sea-skimming cruise missile, one by a more demanding target than a drone, was approximately 1.5 nautical miles. The frigate's pier position placed it approximately 400 meters from the destroyer, and the 2 ships' CIWS coverage overlapped across the pier approaches. At 4:18 a.m. and 21 seconds, the leading contacts from all 3 approach axes entered the CIWS engagement envelope simultaneously. Not with the precision of a coordinated arrival, because the slight variations in individual missile flight paths and the course deviations of different units in the formation had introduced timing dispersion across the final miles of approach, but close enough to simultaneously that the multiple CIWS systems defending the base perimeter were all engaging at the same time. The pier-mounted CIWS units, 2 emplaced installations at the base perimeter, each covering a portion of the approach arc, engaged the leading contacts from the northern bearing axis. First contact eliminated at 1.3 nautical miles. Second contact at 1.1 nautical miles. Third contact at 900 meters. Close enough that the debris pattern from the disintegrating airframe scattered across the harbor surface inside the pier breakwater, the fragments losing velocity as they impacted the water in a spread that reached the destroyer's hull side above the waterline. 3 impacts recorded on the destroyer's port side plating above the main deck. No structural penetration, the fragments spent by the time they reached the hull. The destroyer's CIWS forward mount was simultaneously engaging contacts on the northern and northeastern approach axes. 2 contacts eliminated at 1.2 and 1.4 nautical miles respectively. The mount pivoted to the next contacts in its engagement queue. The frigate's CIWS mount engaged 2 contacts on the northwestern approach axis, the axis that had been underserved by the Patriot battery's engagement geometry, and had produced the SM-2 intercept at 15 nautical miles. 1 contact eliminated at 1.1 nautical miles. Second contact engaged at 940 meters. The second contact from the northwestern axis was struck by the frigate's CIWS at 940 meters from the ship, but was not immediately destroyed. The round impacts degraded the missile's airframe integrity without achieving immediate structural failure. Radar return changed character, its flight profile becoming unstable as the aerodynamic damage affected its control surfaces, and the missile began a descent trajectory that took it downward toward the harbor's surface, rather than maintaining the sea-skimming altitude profile of an intact weapon. The contact hit the harbor's surface approximately 600 meters from the frigate's pier position, its impact producing a column of water and a fuel fire that burned briefly on the harbor surface before the spray extinguished it. 600 meters. The harbor surface, not the ship. The remaining two contacts, the last two of 19, were engaged by the destroyer's CIWS aft mount as they cleared the pier breakwater on approach bearings that placed them crossing the harbor interior on trajectories that would have reached the supply ship at the end of the pier structure. The aft mount engaged the first contact at 1.1 nautical miles. Contact eliminated. The second contact, approaching 4 seconds behind the first on a slightly different bearing, was engaged at 980 meters. Contact eliminated. At 4:19 a.m. and 53 seconds, the Air Defense Command Watch Officer confirmed clear picture. No active inbound contacts. 7 minutes and 41 seconds from first radar detection to last intercept. 19 cruise missiles from 3 separate launch positions. 11 interceptors expended by the Patriot battery. 3 SM-2 interceptors from the destroyer. Approximately 9,800 rounds of 20mm through 5 CIWS systems across the installation's pier mounts, the destroyer, and the frigate. 1 contact that impacted the harbor surface inside the breakwater. 0 ships lost. 0 ships with structural damage below the waterline. 3 fragment impacts above the main deck on the destroyer's port side, assessed as cosmetic damage requiring no operational repair before the ship's next underway period. 4 personnel on the base piers, who had been in exposed positions when the terminal engagement began, and who had not reached covered positions before the CIWS engagement, opened sustained minor lacerations from secondary debris. All 4 were assessed and released from the base medical facility within 2 hours. The post-engagement assessment by the regional command reached 2 conclusions with high confidence. First, the attack had been planned and executed with genuine operational sophistication. The 3-axis approach geometry, the missile altitude profiles in the terminal phase that had complicated the Patriot battery's intercept geometry, the deliberate timing that had been calculated to minimize the warning window available to the base's air defense architecture. These were not the characteristics of an improvised strike. They were the characteristics of a target that had been studied carefully, and an attack that had been planned against the specific vulnerabilities of that target's defense configuration. Second, the attack had been defeated by a combination of factors that the planners had apparently assessed as more favorable to them than they proved to be. The maintenance period on the destroyer's VLS cells had been either observed or correctly inferred, and the attack timing had been chosen to exploit the reduced interceptor availability that maintenance represented. What the planners had not correctly assessed was the emergency recovery timeline, the time it would take to close the cells and bring them back to operational status under actual alert conditions, with a crew operating under the specific urgency of knowing that missiles were inbound. The recovery was 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The planners had apparently assessed it as longer. 2 minutes and 12 seconds of SM-2 intercept window had been the result of that miscalculation. 2 minutes and 12 seconds, 3 SM-2 interceptors, and 3 contacts eliminated. Against 19 inbound missiles, 3 contacts was the difference between a clean engagement and one where something reached the pier area. The Patriot battery was reloading. The VLS maintenance had been completed under the emergency conditions of the alert. The cells sealed and tested in the time available. The base's pier operations resumed with the normal post-incident administrative cycle. Damage assessment, medical accounting, threat picture update, the contact report chain that would eventually produce the intelligence community's assessment of what had just happened and what it meant for the threat environment going forward. The harbor water, which had briefly burned with the fuel of the contact that had impacted inside the breakwater, was calm. The sun had not yet risen. The piers were quiet with the specific quiet of a place where something serious had happened, and the personnel who remained had done what needed to be done, and were now doing the next thing that needed to be done, which was less urgent, but no less necessary. Naval Station Bahrain remained operational. Every ship that had been alongside remained afloat. The mission that the installation existed to support, the sustained presence of U.S. naval power in the Persian Gulf region, had not been interrupted. But the installation's air defense picture had been updated by the engagement in ways that were not entirely comfortable. 19 missiles had required 11 Patriot interceptors, 3 SM-2 interceptors, and the full commitment of 5 CIWS systems to defeat, with the harbor water as the terminal backstop for the one contact that survived the outer and middle layers, or a second attack of equal scale, arriving before Patriot and VLS inventories could be reconstituted from the logistics chain, would present a materially more difficult engagement. The reconstitution timeline for the Patriot battery's expended interceptors was 48 to 72 hours under normal logistics priority. Under emergency priority, it could be accelerated, but not to hours, and not without drawing from inventories that had other commitments across the regional air defense architecture. The adversary who had planned this attack could do that arithmetic as well as anyone in the regional command. They had done it before the attack. They were doing it again in its aftermath. The Gulf holds no permanent victories. It holds only the record of what was defended and what the defense cost, and the unfinished question of whether the next engagement will find the same resources available to answer it.